Hello, my name is José Ignacio Fiori, and today I will present to you the one of the most underrated fronts of the Second World War, which was the North Africa campaign. So, for this presentation, I actually had to do something I never thought I would have to do, study. But yeah, um, I will present to you this. I chose this topic because I would like to bring light to one of the most interesting and battled fronts, in my opinion. Um, yeah, respects to all the fallen, by the way. So today we will start with a man and a crazy dream, which is Benito Mussolini and his dream to basically reform the Roman Empire, which, by the way, if you had any common sense, that would never happen. But yeah, so Benito Mussolini had this crazy dream to restore the frontiers of the Roman Empire and control basically the Mediterranean. And if you know anything about the maps in World War II, the Mediterranean was basically controlled by the British and basically the Allies. So one problem they had for this was that the two main entrances to the Mediterranean were controlled by the British, which are these red circles here. I would have liked to have made them smaller, but that was sadly not possible. But yeah, so this circle you see here, if you can see my mouse in Egypt, down here is the Suez Canal, which was what connected the Red and Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. And up here in Spain, is very small, so you can see it, but basically is the Gibraltar Strait and the Gibraltar itself, which was also controlled by the British. So if you can see here that Italy and its colonies in Libya were basically surrounded. So that had to be taken over. So as the war between the French and the British and Germany began, Italy also began opening its fronts, and it started massing huge amounts of troops in this frontier here to invade Egypt and attack the British basically by surprise. But before we get into the actual battlefield, I would like to explain what contemporanean commanders and strategists thought desert warfare was going to be like. They thought that desert warfare would be like a giant chessboard for tanks, infantry, and all that stuff to fight. They thought that the terrain being plain and having no cover and basically being like a duck shot, basically, would make it extremely easy and would be similar to warships gliding in the ocean or swimming or floating or going through the ocean, basically. But they couldn't be further from the truth. Desert warfare was an absolute logistical nightmare. Basically, um, no cover also meant no trees, no roads, no mountains, no hills, which basically made that any plane going through scouting the area could see you miles away. And that meant that you were a clear target for marine strikes, um, air attacks, ambushes by troops, etc. And if you know anything, that would be very bad. The distance as well, I would like to go to the last presentation. It was very, if you could see the map here, it was very difficult to get supplies through. So basically, here there was the port of Tripoli, and over here was the port of Benghazi, which were two of the most important ports where they took supplies from. And they had to go all the way to here and if they advanced deeper into Egypt, they had to go even further to get the supplies, and that was extremely long, extremely difficult for the mechanics at the time, and the convoys were assaulted a lot, and yeah, it was very bad. So now we get to the fighting. So basically, the Italians started with around 100 to 300,000 troops in the front, and advanced very slowly because direct orders from Benito Mussolini that wanted to attack instead of waiting for anything, because really it was the smartest option because the Egypt had very little resistance, but actually the advance was very slow because of the amount of troops they had and how little tanks they had. So it was very difficult to advance, and they went here, around here, to the city of Sidi Barrani where they arrived, but they couldn't move any forward because of British attacks. But now we will go to the side of the British. The British had very little troops to defend Egypt. They had like 25,000 or less. Most of them were colonial troops from India and Australia and places like that, and they basically assaulted the Italian advance with bluffing techniques, which was basically attacks that made the British army look way bigger than it actually was. And it was very effective, which made the Italians get stuck at Sidi Barrani defending it, and the British jokingly call it the Sitzkrieg. And yeah, that was very ineffective. And then Operation Compass began, which was basically an assault by the British to push back the Italians with these techniques that we already mentioned. And what can I say? It was extremely effective. Nivewa and Bardia were the main fronts. Nivewa was a battlefront over here in the south of Sidi Barrani that was used to attack and basically encircle the Italians. It was carried out by Indian troops, actually, mainly, and that made the Italians forcibly get pushed back. And then Bardia was another target, which was taken by the New Zealander troops. And they got there and also managed to take it. And basically, that meant that the Italians had to were pushed back all the way to further than south than Benghazi. And here is where they made an amazing move, which was instead of following the Italians all the way through the coastline, they went through the desert of Cyrenaica and encircled the Italians as they were retreating. So basically, trucks full with equipment and stuff were pushed back and were ambushed by the British behind their lines and basically encircled them near Breda Farm here, and basically captured the entire Italian army. And this was extremely very big defeat to Italians, and the British were very confident that they weren't going to attack again the Italians, so they moved. They did a very big mistake here. They basically moved their most of their army to Greece because they wanted to defend it from a possible German attack, and that would be very bad for their colonies in the Mediterranean, like Malta and Crete. And they moved most of their troops and left some colonial forces to defend the rest of Libya, which was all of this. They had already taken this. But then Rommel and the Africa Corps came and made a huge counterattack in Operation Sonnenblume, which basically meant Operation Sunflower. And they basically pushed back the British, which were sent retreating because they had no manpower, no tanks, and they couldn't do anything. So the Germans advanced towards here, where was the city of Tobruk, and they reached there. And most of the Australian army was encircled in Tobruk, where they would prepare to defend it. But Tobruk was very very much a fortress, so they couldn't. So the Germans had a difficult time attacking it. But then, Operation Cruz, as the Germans pushed the British back to the main front lines here, that basically meant that the British had lost almost their entire territory they conquered. And then a change of general was needed, so Churchill deposed the current general of Egypt and brought another one from India, which was called uh, Ok. They called him the Ok because his surname was kind of weird. But yeah, Operation Crusader began, which was a push with many colonial troops to liberate the city of Tobruk and the armies of the Australians, which were holding on for 8 months with the help of the Royal Navy, bringing them resources through the port because the navy was more the seas were controlled by the British, so it wasn't very hard. But Tobruk, you have to understand that it was an extremely strategical port, and it basically was the artery of supplies to the front line, and it was controlled by the Australians, so the resources took a lot longer to reach the front line, and that was very bad. So the Germans started having the supply crisis, which was basically they had very little gas, which is going to haunt them through the whole war, really. But in this front, it was very bad. And Rommel, after the Operation Crusader, which actually failed and they were pushed back, was forced to retreat because they had no resources. So after 8 months of siege, Tobruk was liberated by a German retreat and not actually a German loss. So they went back to the lands they had in the Operation Sonnenblume before the start, and they were forced to resupply and attack again. So then the Germans began a second attack, which meant that they had to attack basically after resupplying, and they attacked, and they were pushed back until over here. Let me show you the map. Basically, around here, they reached, and after they were pushed back over here, they were supplied and they came back here. And the British prepared a defense line called the Gazala line near the city of Gazala and stretched it for miles. I would like to show you the map down here. And basically, the Germans attacked this line, and the British were scared that the Germans would attack through the south with tanks or whatever and encircle the entire line, which is exactly what they did. And it was fairly easy to attack it, but they ran out of gas. Their tanks ran out of gas around here, and basically they encircled themselves, which and this was called the Cauldron, and it was a very bloody fight. But the Germans managed to break the Gazala line, and basically the Cauldron was liberated because the tanks, with the little fuel they had, managed to break through. And then they reached Tobruk, which is over here. And surprisingly, this battle lasted an amazing 24 hours. So it was very unaffected, the defense, and they took it in less than a day because of the heavy tanks that they used to attack it. And now they reached the city of El Alamein, which is over here, was a very small train station where the line was. And here, if they managed to take El Alamein and defeat the troops of the British, they would basically leave Cairo as the next strike target by the Germans. But they couldn't do that. So they prepared a defense with new equipment and new generals. And here is where Montgomery, which is one of the main characters of this front, would appear. With new tanks, new equipment, and a very strong mentality of no more retreating, they would strike the Germans with brutal force, and the Germans had very little tanks because of what happened in the cauldron and everything, and they were running out of fuel, resources, etc. And it was very grueling for the Germans to basically get resources because the convoys had to travel an amazing distance, attacked by the Royal Navy. So basically, like one third of the resources arrived, so it was very hard. And then they began the second battle of El Alamein, which was a push by Montgomery to break through the German defenses with the new Shermans. And the attack began um, in 1940, at the beginning of 1942, where they managed to attack the Germans with the tanks. The Panzers, which were the German tanks, were very effective at killing the British tanks, which basically meant that they were killing four for every one they lost. But because of the numerical advantage and the lack of resources the Germans had, the crisis, they were forced to retreat back to Cyrenaica, where they wouldn't attack back because it would be basically impossible. They were on the chase and they had to retreat. But here is where something amazing happened. The Americans arrived. So the Americans, before any of the D-Day and everything, were forced to. They prepared an attack to the Morocco, and by with the together with the British, they planned the attack across the western Mediterranean coast of Africa, where they would begin a second front to relieve Egypt. And here they had some fears that Spain would actually intervene, but because they were basically crossing a huge amount of troops through their naval frontiers, which was believed that we would bother them, but it actually didn't. And then the French, they were also scared that the Vichy French, which were a German protectorate at the time, would actually resist, but they thought they wouldn't because they were French and they hated the Germans. But in some places they were so confused because they weren't told that the Americans were coming, that they actually resisted and attacked. And this was mainly here in Casablanca, where the main American um, troops landed. And then it was pretty much taken after a little bit of resistance, where they also took French troops into the American army, and they advanced through the entirety of Algeria without German resistance because there were no Germans there to resist, and they reached Tunis. Here, the Rommel's armies that were retreating from the loss at the Second Battle of El Alamein reached Tunisia, and here they began to corner themselves. This was the last place they could remain, and because the entirety of Libya was lost to the British because of their retreat. And here in Tunis, they prepared to make a last defense because they weren't allowed to retreat by Hitler, which didn't allow them to do so. And they prepared to defend at Tunis and over here in the fortress city of Bizerte, where they prepared a very stubborn defense that they weren't going to let go. They also prepared here in the city of Mereth. They prepared the Mereth line, which was actually a French defense, but they took it, the Germans, and prepared it. They were basically cornered all over here, and they prepared a battle to defend against the Americans, the British through the south, and everything. The battles were very difficult, and they had actually to attack before the rains came in approximately, I believe it was November, which would basically mean that the roads were uncrossable, and basically whoever owned Tunis would get around a month of peace. So they attacked in Catherine Pass. It was one of the main places where Rommel decided to attack the Americans to hopefully break the siege, and which failed miserably because the Americans had this place reinforced. They could either attack Tebesa or Cacerin, but they decided to attack Cacerin, which failed because they were very well fortified there. And after around months of fighting, they were pushed by Montgomery's forces in Meredith. They were pushed over here, and instead of retreating, they were forced to defend. Rommel actually had to leave because he felt sick and he was retreated back to Europe, and the commander that stayed here didn't want to retreat. So they basically resisted in Tunis and Bizerte for some months until they eventually surrendered because they had no support, no resources, and yeah, it was very bad. And then the Allies won, basically. The Germans and the Italians surrendered, and the taking Tunis actually meant that they could start the second phase of the operation to relieve this Europe, which was Operation Avalanche, which was an attack on Sicily and then on Italy, which happened before D-Day and was the first naval invasion that they planned. But yeah, the British and Americans learned to teamwork, and Rommel then in 1944 was discovered by Hitler that a group of generals wanted to make him the new Führer, which Hitler didn't like. And Rommel, even though he had no intervention on this, was forced to take his own life. And that is the end of the North Africa campaign, which lasted around 1940 to 1943. So 3 grueling years of fighting. Thank you. I hope you kept your sanity